Well, we're going to begin our discussion on the remainder of the wisdom books: Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. But before I do that, I want to just come into the recording view, and I'm trying out some of my technology. And there's my talking head, and just to say hello to you face to face, if you're an online student, and just tell you how much I'm enjoying interacting with a lot of you via email and certainly through the class. I just looked this morning and saw that we were very successful launching our first journal assignment, turned in last Friday by midnight, and a few of you emailed me and let me know of some cases where the dog ate your computer or you were taken over by a wild herd of stampeding buffalo or something like that, which is entirely fine. But you can always email me if there's something, even if you're on campus, if you've got a chance to visit the campus. Some of you are like maybe an hour away, and you might come to the library and check out some books. Stop by my office in Fleming 113 and meet my wonderful assistant Emily and my faithful assistant Heath and say hi. So that'll be great. So hope you enjoy the class. A lot of you have really told me some positive feedback so far and how the class is designed, and I'll try to keep these mini lectures as efficient as I can in covering the material. I'm giving you the PowerPoints, and you can fire those up and read those almost like a textbook as well. And by the time you get to the end of the week, we'll have some good information for you that you can use to formulate your response to the theological journals. This one's involving 4 different books, so you want to submit one document, and in that one document you can go a little shorter on the length, single spaced, but you're going to do a separate one for each of the 4 books this week. And as you read in the Turn It In portal, you won't have a focus question for each of the 4 books. That's just going to be too much. So what you'll do is just focus on the theological big idea, author, audience, and any comments that you might have that relate to application for the modern church. All right, fair enough? And just as a way of reminder, now I've disappeared, sorry. Now I'm going to be impersonal. So I can eat my cherries and my carrot sticks in privacy when I hit pause. So that's what I'm doing right now, just so you know behind the scenes. No, we had a lively conversation today in class. Some of the students distant students showed up live to the Adobe session. So check out the announcement that I posted with the details on that. And that's something that you can do any week of the semester. It's entirely optional. But if you have that time, if you're not working or if you're just at home wondering what to do, you can show up to class live from 8 to 10:45 on Monday and experience that and see kind of what it's like. Students that do that tell me that it's something they enjoy and appreciate. So it's just another level of layer of access that you can have to the class as we progress from week to week. But watching the more abbreviated tape delay version that I'm preparing for you now is certainly entirely acceptable. So that option is also continues for you as the semester goes on. The book of Psalms demonstrates to us that there was always a faithful remnant around that in Israel's history, no matter how bad things got in the kingdom, whether we're talking about the United Kingdom for 120 years of Saul, David, and King Solomon, or the divided kingdom, a 400-year period, there was always a worshiping community in Israel who were serious about worshiping God. So here's our deep thought picture. We have worship and we have palms, palm trees, which is Psalms. That's the deep thought picture. The scholars started studying the Psalms. The German scholar most famous for categorizing various types of Psalms was Hermann Gunkel, operating back, surprisingly, in the 1920s. So not too terribly long ago. The basic literary types of Psalms, that of hymn and lament. I've given you a few more categories here, and just take a look at some of those categories and look up the examples that I give you in the more detailed PowerPoint notes. And we won't cover that for the purpose of time, but you can get a sense of why these categories of Psalms work. hymns of praise, obviously focusing on Yahweh, royal psalms that bring in more of the theology of the Messiah, psalms of thanksgiving. How does God or Yahweh respond to his people in times of need? And then we have categories of laments. Individual laments, for example, Psalm 51. That's the psalm that King David wrote after messing up with Bathsheba, that incident. And then more corporate laments or community laments as well. But I make the point in class is the thing to appreciate if you're involved in a church in some capacity of decision making and you're designing a church service, why not include various components of these psalms, the different kinds of psalms that introduce and invite various forms of expression in the form of worship. For example, a lament. Do we sing enough laments during our church service, giving people a chance to, whether it be individually or corporately, express sorrow over sin? Doesn't seem like it'd be something that we'd want to incorporate in our normally bright and cheery worship time, where we're trying to, obviously the point is to focus people on God, but sometimes it's the very focusing on who God is that forces me to my knees in a humble response or a response of reverence in light of who God is. So there I've got to really deal with sin, and that's exactly the point. That's what Israel was doing in their church service in the day, as is evidenced in the various types of psalms that we have. Let's break this down even further. Here's Psalm 54, and I give you an example of scholars who study this will look at each various type of psalm and offer like categories where they see patterns. For example, within a large type category, within a large type of psalm, they look for these common characteristics, you might say. So within Psalm 54, which is true for other individual laments, we have an invocation, a petition, a complaint, an expression of trust, a call for vengeance, a vow, and an explanation of praise. So, exclamation of praise. So, for example, you've got those elements. So, thinking about a song or a purpose of a worship experience for an individual, when's the last time we've introduced or given individuals a chance to complain? Doesn't seem wholly irreverent, does it? But when you think about it, if you look at the text of this psalm, the psalms are honest, and they're interacting with a real God who has real concern for his people. And it's like what we saw with Job. There are times when it's appropriate to be very honest before God. I use my brother-in-law as an example, who's really going through a hard time right now, having just recovered from a surgery where he had to go in for some corrective surgery, and literally on the way to his car in the parking lot, where my dad was present, his heart stopped beating 3 times, and they resuscitated him. And then he goes back home to recover, and in the process learns that cancer has come back to his bones. I think it's okay for him to complain, but in a way that points him back to the next element, and that's an expression of trust. We don't want to discourage people from being honest before God and expressing how they really feel, because quite frankly, God knows how they feel. He's been incarnate. He understands the human experience, and he's sovereign over it, as we saw with the book of Job. So somehow that can turn into worship and praise. That's the challenge of anyone out there who's leading worship in our churches. You all who are doing that, I envy you and I encourage you, and I have all the utmost of respect for you to design your worship services in a way that brings in the variety of these open and honest experiences before the God whom we're worshiping. And in the notes here, you can look at the details and read some more examples of psalms and the different types that we have we're studying. I like to highlight Psalm 119, and I just read the first 8 verses there in class. But that psalm, if you look at the text, and it's the longest psalm, obviously. It's built around the acrostic idea. Every little mini section of Psalm 119 begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, beginning with Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, etc. And what you find is this tremendous celebration of the Torah. And one wonders, sometimes we get the idea, or we present the idea, or we hear the idea that, oh, everybody in the Old Testament was just under this ball and chain of legalism. The expectation was for perfection and sinless perfection, and nobody was allowed to sin, and nobody, if they sinned and they blew it and they lost their salvation. I mean, I've heard all kinds of variations of this, but if you read Psalm 119, they're celebrating in worship the Torah, which is the word that's translated law in the New Testament context, but it's built off the word, as you've heard me say, Yerah, which means to teach or instruct. So actually in worship, in Psalm 119, they're celebrating the freedom and the grace of knowing how to respond to God with instructions, with commands, with stipulations, which with all of the different words basically all point to the same thing. It's the instruction of Torah is the object of celebration. So it's not a woe is me, but it's the opposite. It's a celebration of opportunity. So just a few words on some of the clues that we have in the text that come to point us to perhaps the author. And you've got these phrases of David, of Asaph, or of the sons of Korah, or even of the sons of Asaph. The lamed in Hebrew there on the front end, it could be translated by or of, which would mean ownership or authorship, but could just as well be translated to or for in the sense of belonging, or even the idea of that they were written for or collected by someone. So it's kind of a both and it's not an issue to break a church up over. It's clear to say, from Amos 6:5 and 1 Samuel 16, beginning in verse 14, David had some music skills. He was writing some of these psalms. And whether they were written by him or collected by him, I think the one thing that we say about King David is that he was consistently expressing Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20 criteria for being a good king in Israel. His psalms were a means by which he was alerting his congregation, which was his kingdom, to what it looks like to walk in covenant relationship. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. What did he do when he blew it with Bathsheba? He wrote Psalm 51, right? As a response to model to his people, his congregation, his kingdom, how one should respond when they fall. Now, of Asaph, those are Psalms 73 through 83 and a renegade Psalm 50. And we read about Asaph in Chronicles 15, 1 Chronicles 15:19, and in chapter 16 and 4 and following. Asaph is identified as a musician and a lead singer. Later in 1 Chronicles 25, verse 1, we have a reference to the sons of Asaph. So similarly, we have the sons of Korah, and they were probably a group that came from the northern sanctuary in Dan. Dan is that northern sanctuary in the nation of Israel, and that was where they were worshiping the one true God. So sanctuary locations in Israel. So this is what we have. This is indicative of a collection of originally written psalms, as well as other psalms that were written by song leaders in Israel's faith tradition, church life, you might say. And there's all kinds of musical instruments, as you can see in the slide: lyre, harp, horn, trumpet, pipe, cymbals, tambourines. I'm pretty sure that covers all the instrumentation for a well-equipped chapel choir, or a church orchestra, I should say. And here's just an application of what we saw, we talked about last week with the how biblical parallelism works. So Hebrew poetry, which we have in Psalms, and as we'll see in Proverbs and all the other wisdom books, are largely built on this biblical Hebrew poetry idea, or this parallelism. It's not a da 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 fill in the blank, da 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 da. We have patterns that emerge in Hebrew parallelism, but remember we talked about synthetic, or I should start with synonymous parallelism, where the two line ideas go together. We talked about antithetic parallelism, which separates opposites. So the second line is the opposite of the first line. And then we have, I should say, I started with synonymous, and then synthetic at the end. The last one is the category where the second idea, B, in some way expands or offers more information or explanation for the first line. So if we look at Psalm 51, be gracious to me, God, and then we have the synthetic parallel idea, which is a more information, according to your faithful love, and then we have synonymous, according to your abundant compassion. And then we go back to the original A idea, blot out my rebellion, which if you connect the A column, the two ideas there, those are a synonymous parallelism. Be gracious to me, God, blot out my rebellion, wash away my guilt, and cleanse me from my sin. So I may not have sent that right. Let me back up for a second. Yeah, I think I said it right. So if you go down the first column, all of those ideas are synonymous with regards to the fact that they all are unpacking the same idea, only using slightly different terminology. So the idea of God being gracious involves blotting out rebellion, washing away guilt, and cleansing from sin. So that's how this works. So you can read Psalms, and if you're cognizant or aware of these lines and how they work, you look for those relationships, and it just leaps off the page. So hopefully you'll use that in your own personal interpretation. Every now and then I'll throw in a kind of a personal research project or observation. I've been thinking through something with regards to a particular grouping of psalms, and they're called the Songs of Ascent. And those are Psalm 120 through 134. And within that group of psalms, you have the various types: hymns, laments, and thanksgiving. But the Hebrew word ascent is oftentimes translated stair or step. And the idea is that, like you think of going up the steps of let's say a temple, or the idea of ascenting, the ascent of climbing up those steps, like this picture. And scholars have different ideas about how what would have been the life setting or the function of these Psalms 120 through 134. Pilgrims, perhaps, going up to Jerusalem to participate in some of the religious festivals, Feast of Tabernacles, for example. Others have suggested the context is the basic ascent back to Jerusalem that involved the pilgrims returning from exile. So after the 70 years in Babylonian captivity, after the Cyrus decree, the pilgrims come back. And where are they going? They're going to the temple. So that's an idea. Another idea is these were songs that were sung to commemorate the Feast of Tabernacles in the time of Nehemiah, in and around the completion of the walls. Well, the common ground to all of these scholarly opinions is it involves going to the temple in Jerusalem, perhaps. Now, if you look at the 2 Chronicles chapter 36, my observation is the very last word, the author of Chronicles cuts off the Cyrus decree right at the word, if you've noticed this, let him go up. So there's a sense of an open invitation. And what gets left out of the Cyrus decree by the author of Chronicles is the whole bit about going to the temple. Where the temple, the one that's being basically, refurbished under the leadership of Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, and Ezra. So what's going on here? Well, you see, and I'll show you, and if you look at, kind of builds on Isaiah chapter 2, for example. And if you start reading in chapter 2, beginning in verse 2, it will come about in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. And you've got this focus on the mountain of the Lord and what's going on there. And he will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, and here's the idea in the verb form, the same three-letter root that's forming the verb here is the same root that's formed the noun form of stair or step. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. So what's that house? What's at the top of the mountain? What mountain? Mount Zion. And what's going on there? It's the house, it's the temple, it's where the throne of God will be when he comes to rule and rule over and reign over the people, the faithful, and the nations. And that's what's going to happen on the day of the Lord. It's when that day. It's the prophetic looking ahead down the road. So it's interesting that the author of Chronicles sets us up for this eschatological invitation to that day that's yet to happen. And there's more to be said about this, but it's very intriguing to me. Just thought I'd throw that out as a thought exercise for you. Now we get into wisdom and the book of Proverbs. The idea of wisdom, wisdom material, kings in the ancient world would collect libraries of wisdom material. They would, in the case of Solomon, I'll argue, write their own wisdom material and contribute to their own library. Solomon, of course, received the gift of wisdom, so it really makes sense to identify him, like we did with David, as an author of songs because of his gift of musicianship. Here we have Solomon with the gift of wisdom, and he's contributing to this corpus, this proverb. So wisdom, the idea, skill in doing something, intelligence, or more importantly, I would argue, good moral sense. And in some way, wisdom can also relate to the idea of having a deep understanding of the profound issues of life. The proverb was really it represents that short, pithy saying that's very practical and relates to a very broad kind of common ground experience for all people. And in some ways, it's easy to think of Proverbs as somewhat of a practical application of the Torah. And the Proverbs really focus in on practical matters of everyday life. Like one of the big, it's the famous favorite book of Dave Ramsey because it focuses so much on financial responsibility and principles of finances, or parents who are raising their children. There's stuff like that about being a good parent and the relationship of a father to a son, the instructional role of parents. It's all there. The Proverbs 31 woman at the end. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So all of this is important in the book. One of the things that we talk about with regards to Proverbs, scholars will point this out, there seems to be some borrowing, you might say, in Proverbs from some other wisdom texts in and around the ancient world. In this case, we have Amenanope, which is an Egyptian text that comes from the 12th century BC Egypt. The official title is The Instruction of Amenanope. So it's like Proverbs. It reflects short wisdom sayings or pithy proverb sayings, but they're coming from, in this case, Egypt. So what we have to talk about here is how this relates to the biblical text, because Proverbs 22, there's a section there in Proverbs 22 that's really borrowing from this source material coming out of Egypt. Scholars will talk about, well, did the author of Proverbs borrow from the author of Amenanope, or did the author of Amenanope borrow from Proverbs? Or is there some third document that both groups are basically drawing from? And so you read Amenanope chapter 2, you see this: beware of robbing the poor and oppressing the afflicted. But the equivalent proverb is slightly reworked, but very, very close to the basic core. Rob not the poor, for he is poor. Neither oppress or crush the lowly in the gate. So what we need to say about this, it's just as well to say that all truth is God's truth. And if you've got something going on in Egypt, which would have made sense, they were one of the leading cultural centers of the day. They had a very sophisticated, well-defined culture, and as an overflow of the the reflection of the image of God bearing, which anyone in Egypt would have had, they were reflective of God's creation. They had the ability to look around in His natural revelation, make observations, and come up with truth statements about the things that they were observing. And it seemed as if they had a concern for the needs of the poor and the needy in their caring community. Well, that's a universal truth. That's a common cultural experience, people's concern for the poor and the needy. Deep down in everybody's heart of hearts, there's kind of a caring sense. So the Proverbs will repackage it slightly, but it becomes part of the corpus of Proverbs. and Solomon or others were responsible for overseeing the authorized bringing in. This case, Solomon, for example, wouldn't have been the author, but in this case, he may have been the editor or the redaction of this proverb. So I hope that's clear and helps you a little bit with understanding that what's going on there. Here's another example in Amenopi. Associate not with a passionate man, nor approach him for conversation. Leap not to cleave to such a one, that terror carry thee not away. And there again, you're talking about somewhat of a universal experience. The Proverbs comes along, do not befriend the man of anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest thou learn his ways and take a snare for thy soul. You don't want to identify with someone who's got this mean spirit. As both of these Proverbs point out, he may rub off on you a little bit. You don't want to become ensnared in his ways. So, another way of saying it is, be careful about the friends that you choose, for example. And even in the book of Proverbs, we have examples of in-house revision going on. So the first proverb, 13:14, says this: the teaching of the wise is a fountain of life, so that one may avoid the snares of death. Well, that's kind of like a more, you might say, secular version of a universal truth kind of proverb. You always want to be attracted to being privy to teaching of wisdom, teaching of people who are wise, those who have gone through life, have life skill from experience, or just a time to think about stuff, and they're sharing that wisdom with you. Sit at their feet is the idea, so that you avoid the pitfalls or the mistakes that others may have made. Well, Proverbs 14:27 comes along and brings that proverb or that idea into the realm of the fear of the Lord. So the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, so that one may avoid the snares of death. So there you have kind of an intentional revision, but draws to where the thesis statement is in Proverbs, the whole book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. If you go back and read that, it sets out the fear of the Lord as really the foundational theme of the whole book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So it's there's the parallel. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, ergo wisdom is a fountain of life. So you've got that continuity going on. So both are true. One has a more secular, one has a more theological tone to it. So that's the kind of thing that goes on. A little bit more clear in the book of Proverbs, we do have some first level subheads that set out the larger sections of the entire corpus. And these are set off in chapter 1, verse 1, with which kind of collects the first 9 chapters. And it says Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And then we have chapter 10 through 22, which is a huge corpus there, Proverbs of Solomon. 22 and 24, a couple chapters there with the title, The Words of the Wise. And then one little chapter or portion of a chapter, also sayings of the wise. And then we have a little bit more further down, perhaps the historical timeline, the Proverbs of Solomon, which the officials of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. And then we have the words of Agur and the words of Lemuel, the last couple chapters. The words of Lemuel basically constitute the Proverbs 31 chapter there at the end. So this just represents the fact that the book of Proverbs represents historically a corpus of material that was brought in during the time of the kings in Israel. Now we've already mentioned that the big idea is set out in Proverbs chapter 1, there in verse 1 through 7. So you see there that the fear of the Lord has that idea of the covenant background and meaning. Fear of the Lord describes one's loyal posture before God, one who's inclined to walk in obedience before the Lord. So it's interesting. That's the foundation for a document that is a collected group of wisdom sayings, which is really the application or the feet to the instruction that has come to Israel through the Torah. Deuteronomy 10:12 through 13 says, Moses says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord require from you? Well, but to fear the Lord your God." How? To walk in all his ways, love him, to serve him, the Lord your God, with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, and to keep the Lord's commands, his statutes, which I'm commanding you today for your good. So there's the continuity with the Torah, the teaching of Moses, and what he says there is also, it's all in the foundation of the fear of the Lord. It's one's right orientation for God. It's the inclination to be obedient. And there's so all the instruction that happens in Proverbs is really, in a way, a continuation of that which has already been expressed in the Torah with a little more practical application side to it. And here's a slide that shows you how Proverbs are built on the idea of being a short, pithy saying. So every verse is almost a self-contained unit. But also, it's also built on the Hebrew parallelism categories that we looked at before. So Proverbs 12:25, anxiety weighs down the human heart, but a good word cheers it up. There you have the word but, so that sets up the antithetic parallelism, the parallel relationship. I like this one. 15:17 says, better is a dinner of vegetables where love is than a fatted ox and hatred with it. So another small subcategory of antithetic is the idea of a better than saying. Better is this than that. So you've got kind of a comparison, maybe not strongly opposite, but somewhat, different. And you got two scenarios presented here. In the comparison there, that you compare the vegetables with a plate full of fatted ox, meat versus potatoes, so to speak. And then you've got the comparison of love or absence of love. So what you do when you read a short, pithy saying like this is you stop and reflect and think about it. You've really got to think. It challenges you to think. That's the intention. And it's memorable. So you're trying to figure out what is the application of this and what's being said here. And it's kind of like, the common experience that I have had leading mission trips of youth or high school students over to various third world countries. Like we oftentimes would go down to the Dominican Republic. And the common experiences when the kids are down there is they come back and tell their parents, they didn't have anything down there. But they were so happy. And they loved each other. And it's interesting, that's a common experience where you can be and have nothing but yet be very happy. Because you've got your dinner of vegetables, but what's the emphasis? Well, the emphasis is love and care in the dynamics of family relationships. Now, it's not necessarily untrue for that same love to be true for a home where maybe because there's a little more money made, they can afford to serve the meat. But then there's also the potential for love to be there true, because if love is the focus, if the family, the household is one about care and concern for one another, then that can be true regardless of what's being served on the dinner table. That's really a statement of having everything or being wealthy or being poor. So there's a lot to be said theologically from that one short, pithy saying. So have fun with the Proverbs. 19:5 is an example of the synonymous idea that we talked about, where we have the first idea is repeated in the second idea, only with slightly different terminology. A false witness will not go unpunished, and a liar will not escape. And then we have the synthetic idea, where the second idea extends some aspect of the first idea in some way. So here we have the lazy person does not plow in season. Harvest comes, and there's nothing to be found. Somewhat of a cause and effect idea there. But that's the idea of synthetic. So it expounds on or explains. The implications of a lazy person who doesn't plow in the proper season is that he doesn't have a harvest. So you can see some of these are very practical, common experience, are universal truths. What they're brought into the collection of Proverbs. Some of the wisdom sayings that we have that are out in the culture, sometimes people think these are the sayings that come from the Bible. A stitch in time saves nine. Where there's a will, there's a way. The early bird catches the worm. But none of these come from the Bible. Maybe they come from Ben Franklin, but still, nonetheless, they illustrate for us that these kinds of pithy sayings are probably have been around since the inception of civilized humanity. Short, pithy sayings, truths about life, some short, well-written statement that contains some universal truth, everybody reads it and says, yeah, that's true. Now that's what we're talking about. Proverbs 24:33 through 34 sets out the theme of the sluggard. Some of us may need to take heed of. And the sluggard, if you want to take a look at a theme that develops throughout the entire corpus of Proverbs, it's a reoccurring theme and then one that's worth studying. In fact, your high school students, if you're a youth pastor, would certainly benefit from this theme. You can study it on your own. Now, we spent a little time in class talking about Proverbs 31, and I'll let you read that on your own. But the basic idea and the point that I make in class, I've had in ministry experience younger guys come to me and tell me, I'm dating and I'm looking for the Proverbs 31 woman, and I ask, well, what do you mean? And well, the perfect woman. There's this idea of Proverbs 31, and I think in some ways it misinforms guys and puts women in a way under the pile. Really what we have to do is be careful in our interpretation of Proverbs 31, because if you read the details of the text, what we have to do is look for those timeless principles. So by the 5th century BC, in that context, Proverbs 31 woman is being described as one who works with her hands, rises before dawn, is involved in making food for her family, for not only her family but her household servants. She's selling and buying land with the money that she makes from her crafts. She's a night owl. She uses all of her time efficiently. In her free time, she has a side ministry to the poor of the city. She makes her own clothes for her family and her household from the finest of linens. She enhances the job of her husband in some way. She has a side business trading with merchants in garments and linen. She speaks wisdom in every situation, always deals with difficult people with kindness. She uses every productive moment of her day for some productive purpose. And she is one who strives after inward beauty. So what is all going on here? Well, one of the things that we have to recognize is that we're dealing with the big idea, I would argue, is the management of a household, the management of one's household. And in those days, it involved food preparation and the making of one's own clothes, because you didn't have a Kohl's to go to and shop, or a Kroger. We've got a Kohl's and a Kroger across the street from each other where I live in Arlington, and it's convenient because we can go to both and get the job done very efficiently. But what does it mean? I found the Proverbs 31 woman in my wife. Now, what does that look like? I mean, we apply these timeless principles. She manages the household with the microfinances, for example. She balances the checkbook. Who does the dishes? Well, sometimes I do. In fact, I do a lot of the dishes. Do I do laundry? Yep. I manage the macro finances, so the investments, the life insurance, the auto insurance. I take care of the management of the automobiles and certain things around the house, the household chores, taking out of trash, and we split the responsibilities of the household. And in those days, in Proverbs 31, in that time period, the household represented servants and slaves. Everybody in the household had their job and their role. Does that mean we give assignments to our children and certain chores to do? Absolutely. Everybody in the household has a task or tasks to do. So there's the management, there's the oversight of that. Another thing we have to say about Proverbs 31, she's arrived at this. She didn't start this way. She probably learned and she matured and she became this woman as a result of raising kids and growing and developing a household. She got better at these things as time progressed. So this is not something that necessarily just pops out, I'm a Proverbs 31 woman. It takes practice. It's part of putting feet to and practicing these life skills and striving for these things. So the big idea is that a Proverbs 31 woman is someone who is able to manage and organize, you might say. Is that a timeless principle? Perhaps, but even in that, you have to be careful because, I won't go there. I was going to give an illustration of a counseling situation that I'm involved in, but I think for the sake of time, I need to move on. So the book of Ecclesiastes, meaning of life is Chuck Norris. It's the big question. Like the book of Job, why do the righteous suffer? Now we have another big question that's addressed by a single book. And that's really Not what is the meaning of life. That's kind of willy-nilly. What we really need to do is bring it into a covenant context. So the question of the book is, what's the moral value of life? And we have the author identified as Kohelet, literally could be translated preacher, as a son of David, king in Jerusalem. And understand there's a broader discussion out there of authorship and who is this? Is it Solomon? Is it somebody else? And I'm not going to probably adopt some of those other theories. I'm going to stay close to Solomon. And the reason I say that is, like the other books, I would argue, Song of Solomon and also a large portion of Proverbs, we have a king who's writing, having given the gift of wisdom, looking back on his own life with some regret. King Solomon, some of the things that he's about doing in this book applied to him with the expansion of his kingdom, the preoccupation with wealth, pursuits, life pursuits, and the misapplication of wisdom, for example. Even himself he acknowledges, I would argue, and that would be King Solomon, writing near the end of his life, looking back, and like what we see with King David writing Psalm 51, we have King Solomon writing the book of Ecclesiastes and leaving this for his kingdom, basically saying, like all the other wisdom books, don't make these same mistakes. I've gone through this, I've experienced this, I've made some mistakes along the way, don't do a repeat here. And that's I think what the best approach that we can make for the book, and that helps us understand its message. And the big idea of the book is introduced to us in the very first chapter, the idea of vanity of vanities, the idea of futility of futilities. That's the translation I prefer, because futility comes up in the book as something that causes the disintegration, you might say, of the satisfaction that is hoped to come as a pursuit of all these empty and vain excursions along the way. So there in chapter 1 you see the beginning thesis, vanity of vanities, or futility of futilities, says the preacher. And what advantage is man in his own work which he does under the sun? There's a sense in the book of Ecclesiastes that one of the themes that extends through the whole book is that focus on time. The fact that the clock is ticking, the rising of the sun, the setting of the sun, time and evidence of time passing, like the observation there in chapter 1. The wind continues swirling around on its circular courses, rivers flowing into the sea, yet the sea is not full. So there's evidence of time passing, and the author here, I think Solomon, is putting himself in the common experience of all, looking and observing around them and seeing an evidence in nature of everything seems to have its place and move along just fine, but what's my problem? Why don't I get that sense of satisfaction? If I ask a tree, how are you doing, tree? Are you getting along in life? And they'd say, I'm very happy. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. How about you, human being, image of God bearer? And the image of God bearer will say, I'm a little frustrated right now. I'm a little confused. Things don't happen quite the way I had hoped, and I'm trying to get along, but I'm a little confused about what I'm supposed to do. So this is kind of the gist of Ecclesiastes. And you have that in the opening chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. The author's pursuing wisdom, that leads to futility. Pursuing of pleasure, the pursuing of possessions, and the accumulation of wealth. And the author says that leads to futility. And there, chapter 3 is an interesting chapter because there's that famous song written about it, of course, but the focus on time and the passing of time and the appropriateness of everything having its particular place in time, which is really interesting. And with the focus on time, the author then in verse 11 takes it from observations in nature to individual human beings, and he says, God, verse 10 really, I've seen the task which God has given to the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. God, He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. which is really interesting because if there's this sense of eternity in everybody's heart that God is kind of hardwired into the image of God bearing responsibility, then the average guy in the street is experiencing futility because he's not connected that heart with the creator of the universe in a relationship. He doesn't have instruction. He doesn't know how to what to properly pursue under the rubric of the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. So we're going to see that come out at the end of this book as the appropriate launching place. But not until the end of the book do we even hear that. So for the first, 6 chapters, we're in the sense of futility. And this person is bouncing off the walls of futility, getting, the combination of hitting walls and getting your head banged up and falling down and getting up and feeling the pain of life. And there's this sense of inner gnawing in the heart. There's this sense of eternity. I'm not eternal. I want to be eternal, but I'm not sure how. And is there more to life than what I'm experiencing? And all of these things. So the book of Ecclesiastes practically has real apologetical value to it. And we get to the very end, and as I said, you get to the punchline with regards to the purpose. There, chapter 12, verse 13, the author concludes, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commands, because this applies to every person. So how is that moral value of life to be attained or accomplished or understood? Well, it's in the context of fearing God, which basically comes back to that covenant idea of falling in line, or one's heart inclined, one who is inclined their heart towards obedience. So you're putting feet to, in the process of putting feet to faith, you're following through, and in the process of that experience, that's when you are able to experience the fullness of life and understanding meaning and purpose, and not having this sense of dread or doubt. I just throw this slide. I'll let you look at it on your own for the purpose of time, but this basically dismisses the idea that the book of Ecclesiastes is somehow secular and somehow disconnected from the rest of what the Bible teaches. But here I've prepared a slide that kind of brings the book of Ecclesiastes into a lot of what we've already read and understand, things like God being the creator, his role in creation, the idea of what the world is created good, and the corruption that ensued. So a lot of Genesis stuff that's going on in the book of Ecclesiastes. So there's what Genesis lays out as a foundation, for example, serves and follows through into the message of the book of Ecclesiastes. And you thought we'd never get here. Song of Songs. Love and romance in a believing nation. All right, now I'm just going to go out on an interpretive whim here and give you my approach to this book up front. It was a book in its history where Jewish boys under the age of 13 were not allowed to read the book due to its poetic yet somewhat explicit references to what seems to be sexual activity. One solution to this, and a later interpretation, was the allegorizing of the book by the early rabbis into the medieval times, and the medieval interpreters like Origen, even some of the early church fathers, all dealt with the book as either, if you were Jewish, God's love for Israel, or the Christian context, Christ's love for the church. So it depends on where you're at in history. I stay close to the idea of Solomon, and I'm probably in a minority there, as the author of the book. I think the book is addressing, similarly to Ecclesiastes, a theological truth that would have been coming right out of Solomon's own somewhat life of regret looking back. The book celebrates romance in the proper context of a couple in love, and it tracks right along with the cultivation of the romance leading up to dating, courtship, and all the way up to the wedding, the consummation of the marriage relationship on the wedding night, and even beyond. Every step along the way, you have this great picture of someone who's just passionately in love with this woman. Now, how does that fit with Solomon? I think, Solomon is the author. Possibly, I don't think he's writing about his own life, his own love relationship with his one true love. I think that's the whole point. He never got that quite right because he's accumulating women, all of that we see in like the history books of Kings. That was his demise in a way. What Solomon's doing is writing about, I think, the ideal couple, perhaps a couple that he even knew, that was doing it right. And he's bringing them into the context as an example of what to follow for the whole nation. So when they read Song of Solomon, they understand. Now I'll tip my hat early here. We had the beginnings of a conversation about this in class. We just somewhat ran out of time. But let me ask you this. Where in the world should one look to find and see demonstrated what it looks like for a couple, man and a wife, to be in love with each other? Where they should be looking, the world watching, which hasn't the foggiest idea about this, the one place that they should be looking is the church, and couples who are in the church, Christian couples. Christian couples ought to be the center of focus. We ought to be doing it and getting it right with regards to romance. And my thesis is we don't talk about this enough as we should. And I won't go into too much details with regards to why I think that's true. I just see evidence of it because I was teaching this book in a class of undergraduate students, and one semester I had literally a girl stand up and get mad, raise her hand, and say, we shouldn't be talking about sex in any of our classes in college. And she stormed out of the room, and she dropped my class and never came back. And I turned to my class after she left, and I said, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We need to talk more about this, because if there's any place that anybody around that needs to get it right, it's Christian couples. We should be, not like this picture, walking around kissing each other all the time, but at least we should reflect a difference. People should be watching us and seeing there's a couple in love. Look at that. Isn't that cute? That's appropriate in the appropriate way. So let me keep going here with this discussion. And it's probably not as in-depth as you'd like, but nonetheless. And just for the record, I don't like this picture because it somehow portrays King Solomon as talking about in the book his one true love. And as I said earlier, I don't think Solomon necessarily got that entirely correct. I think he's looking back on a life of regret, and what he's doing is portraying a couple in love, at least a model, if not a real, at least talking about a real life couple in his kingdom that he's aware of. So this is the progression that I'm talking about in the book. And you have this progression which really associates to the bigger theme of the celebration of romance, attraction. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. Dating, chapter 1, 8 through 2, 7. Then you've got courtship, 2, 8 through 3, 5. Then you've got the wedding day, 3, 6 through 11. Then you have the wedding night, 4, 1 through 5, 1, which is really where we see the final consummation in the fullness of the celebration of romance on the wedding night, appropriately done. You've got continuing conflict after. You've got more celebration of romance in chapter 7, verse 1, and then finally an affirmation of one's commitment one to another. But you see the appropriateness of the progression. And I borrow this from Danny Eccl, who's the president of Southeastern, who wrote a book called God on Sex. And he did a marriage conference at a church where I was serving up there in southern Indiana. And it was just fantastic for couples to really recognize that here's one book in the Bible that talks about this and makes it okay to celebrate romance in the relationship. Now, I'm not talking about just sex in terms of romance. What I'm talking about is all the various facets of how, for example, the guy would celebrate romance with his wife. All the 101 various ways that he can express how much he loves her, how beautiful she is, how much he appreciates her, and all the ways that we use words, and all the love languages of Gary Smalley's book, Love Languages, Words, Time, Acts of Service, Gifts. All of these are ways that we need to develop and find new ways of celebrating the romance in our marriage relationship. That's how I was won to the Lord, by the way. I guess I have a little bit of a conviction about this, just because when I first started to be introduced to a Christian community, which is part of a church choir, when I started to go to the backyard barbecues, I looked around and saw couples who were treating each other with respect and love, and they hugged each other and held hands and did things, that I was like, wow, they're really different. There's something radically going on here. They're really genuine. They really are serious about how they feel about each other, and they follow through in so many ways. They laugh and enjoy each other and don't, fight. At least they don't fight publicly, and all of these things. So there's a confused world out there. I don't know if you've noticed it or not. And they don't have the foggiest idea of what it really means to be in love in such a way that romance can be genuinely celebrated. They're just couples out there that are married. They're mad at each other all the time, 24/7. They don't know how to resolve conflict. They don't know how to go to each other and say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And things like that. So this can be revolutionary in your ministries to get this right, I think. And just to be short on time here, I just got to finish up. Different kind of a mini history of interpretation. The allegorical interpretation, beginning with the rabbis, and then transitioning to the early Christian interpretations. Origen, for example. Luther kind of went with a more literal translation, but Solomon's talking about his relationship with God, for example, kind of an individual. And we have in the 18th century, Robert Lothan getting a little more specific, where Solomon's marriage to one of the daughters of Pharaoh. So there's the example of Solomon talking about one of his own marriage relationships, but I think that's a little weak. Or dramatic love poem, which I'm a little closer to, a literal, but I think Solomon still is talking about a real couple in love, using them as an example for his kingdom. And this is kind of a funny caricature. This is what you have to be careful of, is how does somebody describe beauty, for example, as part of the celebration of romance. And this is the famous chapter, how beautiful are you, my darling, how beautiful are you. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats. There you have them, the flock of goats that have descended from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn ewes, which has come up from their washing, all of which bear twins. It's just a ancient way of saying your teeth are bright and white, right? It's the way they talked about things back then. So it sounds kind of corny, but what you have to appreciate about this is the poetry, and the description is rich. And here's someone describing in so many different angles, from so many different angles, the beauty of the one whom he's in love with. You married guys out there need to take heed of this. Verse 3, your lips are like scarlet thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your temple's like a slice of pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, with rows of stones on which hung 1,000 shields, and there they are, dripping honey. And I skipped over verse 5, but anyway, you get the idea. And so this is something that is significant with regards to how one would celebrate romance through the description of his wife who's beautiful. And marriage counseling that I've done, I'm involved in a session right now where I'm trying to encourage the guy to, instead of coming home and opening up the drawer of his kid's sock drawer and finding no socks, and criticizing his wife for apparently not having done anything all day, is to get over that. Come home from work, walk over to your wife who's exhausted from having two small children at home, which is one of the most stressful times for wives these days. Stay-at-home moms who take care of kids at home, those husbands need to go home and find 101 different ways to go home. And the first thing that they do is compliment their wife, encourage her, and go over and give her a big hug and tell her how wonderful she is. I mean, if that's not happening, you're setting yourself up for some discouragement and some frustration in the marriage relationship, because those wives who are stay-at-home moms hardly ever get strokes and attaboys and encouragement. The husband has to become the master at knowing the love language of his wife and how to let her know that she's okay. And it's kind of a messy time in life, isn't it? It's kind of like the sock drawer might be empty for a couple of days, until the laundry gets sorted, until the toys get picked up, until the food pantry gets filled up with the right kind of food. Boy, you know, I remember those days. We've got teenagers going off to college, and in some ways things don't change, but you're still always a parent. Your kids will always be your kid. You're always looking out for them. But there comes a time when they have to start making their own adult choices. I talked a little bit about my daughter today and the whole breakup with her boyfriend and stuff. I mean, this is what happens in life. So it's fun, right? And the one thing I can say, it's celebration of romance. I give you permission to celebrate the romance with your wife. And for you singles out there, this is something you'll look forward to at the appropriate time, the celebration of romance and the appreciation of the beauty of your spouse. So it actually can go two ways, right? All right, let me pause. So I think we're done with the discussion of wisdom books, and you've got plenty to go on between the reading and hearing this mini lecture for Friday's submission. Go a little shorter, like I said, on the submissions. Have one submission for each of the 4 books on a single Word document with the title, so we can kind of separate and see what you've done for each book. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Song. You get that submitted by midnight Friday, and then we'll move on to the minor prophets starting next week.